Alright, I'm gonna just start now. And hi. Okay. So today we're just gonna talk about some camera basics. This includes the classic ISO, aperture, shutter speed. So let's just start it. I'm just gonna put on live 1 second. Okay, so here is the exposure triangle. Oh, sorry. I need my pointer. So we have the aperture, we have the shutter speed, and we have the ISO. So I'm gonna briefly talk about what these all are, and we can get into how you can creatively use these three items to make your image better. So as you can see, aperture here, I'm gonna refer it back a lot more. Let's go through these individually. So first off, we have the aperture. What is it? Well, aperture is the opening of the lens. If you can see over here, okay, let's see if I can zoom into myself. Okay, if you see over here, this is a lens, right? As you can see in the front, there's an opening, right? And this is not turned on, but if you turn this on, you can manually dial in using the backhand scroll, right, to change your aperture. Essentially, what aperture is, it's the opening of the lens, right? The more you open in, right, the larger the circle, the more light you're allowing in, okay? So this way you can have a blurry background, in which we'll talk about after. But the smaller the circle, the less light we'll get in, and therefore you're gonna have a deeper focus. How do we differentiate different apertures? Well, it's by the f-stops. So these are just fractions, and kind of counterintuitively, but the smaller the fraction, the larger the opening. So if you have an f1.4 aperture opening, that's a pretty huge opening, okay? So yeah, as I said before, if you have a larger aperture, it's gonna be a smaller number, essentially. So 1.4 is a humongous opening, and that can usually only be achieved by a prime lens. So a lens that's only in a specific focal length. And they have 2.8 and so forth, right? If you want to achieve a blurry background, use a lot in portrait shoots, right? You want to isolate the subject. So you don't want to blend the subject in with your background. You may want to have bokeh. So these are blurry circles. As you can see in the grass picture over here, do you see these slightly, whitish circles? Those are bokeh, right? Especially in night photography also. You can have LED lights behind the subject or neon signs. Those can create very, very beautiful and amazing bokehs, and that will shine through, right, entire picture. And they're not distracting as well. They're used to complement your subject. So as I said before, it emphasizes the subject, and it creates isolation, essentially, is what we're doing here. Okay. So whenever you want to, whenever you have a singular subject, you want to, emphasize upon that, you can use a wider aperture or a smaller aperture number, right? And the second usage of aperture, these are all pretty general, but the second usage is the fact that you can use it for deep focus. When will you do this? Okay. Well, let's think about landscape photography. Let's think about cityscape photography. Let's think about if you're photographing a group of people, right? This means that you have a huge area to cover. Therefore, you are going to use a much smaller aperture opening, meaning a higher aperture number. So, for example, like an f7, or f11, or something like that. However, there are some precautionaries of using, high ISO number or smaller ISO, sorry, not ISO, aperture openings, and larger aperture openings, which I'll maybe go over next week when I have Miss Rennick coming here. But these are just two general usages of aperture and how you could use them, right? So once again, if you want to isolate a singular subject or something from the background, you can use a smaller number ISO or a larger opening, so a larger aperture, right? If you want to photograph the entire cityscape or landscape or a group of people, for example, a group portrait, you wouldn't want to use I'll just say f-stop now. So if you wouldn't want to use a low f-stop number because some of them are going to be blurry, right? That's not going to be what you want. So just keep those in mind when you're using aperture. So as we see over here, large means more exposure and small means less exposure. And also you have to keep in mind the amount of light you have, right? If it's in broad daylight, so let's just say today is pretty cloudy, so that's not an issue. But if you are, going out for a shoot at 12 p.m., in the middle of the day when the sun is directly on top of you, you will have to use maybe a neutral density filter. That's an ND filter, right? Something that you can put on your lens, as you can see over here, right? Those one will limit the amount of light and protect your highlights. However, if you don't have such an ND filter, as I don't have, then you might have to force yourself to maybe go to a smaller opening, because there are going to be so much light coming in, you're not going to be able to photograph anything. It's just going to be white, right? But it depends. As you will see after, shutter speed and ISO also controls, how bright an image looks. So maybe if you want to prioritize one thing over the other later on, you can choose how to do that, right? So aperture. Now I'm going to go on to shutter speed. So okay, so aperture and shutter speed are the two creative elements, right? They have substantial meaning toward what you want to create, what you want to portray in an image. And when you have the ISO, it's more like a tool to help you control your aperture, to help you control your shutter speed. Okay, so let's go on to shutter speed. What is it? It's the length of time a camera shutter opens. So what this means is that if I take this off, give me a second. If I take this camera off, right? If I take the lens off, and I have this camera sensor in here, as you guys can see. If I turn this on, right now I'm 1/60 a second. So as you can see, the shutter is open, right? You can see that and you can hear that as well. Of course, that is the camera shutter. Just give me a second. I'm just gonna basically it's the length of the time a camera shutter is open, right? So if I say, if I want to freeze a moment, for example, let's just change to a smaller fraction. That was much faster, right? So you can use it in sports photography when you want to freeze a subject traveling action. When you want to freeze, for example, a person, going around wins the ball and is trying to do a dunk. You want to freeze that, you need to use like a 1 over something, right? So for example, 1 over the 1200, 1 over 1000. Those ensures that the length of the time that the camera shutter is open will be minimized, so you wouldn't have any blurs, right? This is why I said if you want to have a sharp picture who's moving in a fast action, you will want to use like a smaller fraction, right? On the other hand, if you want to have light streaks or light painting, for example, at night, right? Or astrophotography, when you're photographing the stars, you will want to use long exposure. What that means is that the time that your camera sensor is going to be open is going to be for a long period of time, right? I'm going to go to, for example, into the seconds. So right now it's going to be at 6 seconds. If you look, do you see how the camera sensor is open for a long period of time, right? This is going to allow the light to come in. And this is going to allow a lot of light to come in, because the longer your shutter, your camera sensor is exposed to the light, the brighter your image is. And you can capture more information if your light is going through the entire frame, for example. So essentially, that will be for long exposure. Okay, so if you want to have light streaks or beautiful soft waterfall, how do we get the blurry lines going through the waterfall? Long exposure. This is because as you prolong, right, as your camera sensor is exposed to more information of more water coming down, it smoothens out the individual wave of the water coming down, right? And it creates this beautiful, beautiful white splash downward. And as you can see here, where I've chose two images, one is light painting. Essentially, how this person created this image is that this person set the camera on a long exposure, and he has either a flashlight or some sort of light, right? A light stick, for example, and he just draws circles. He draws circles around and around, and then he runs out of the frame. What the camera captures is those lights, right? It's very beautiful. This one here is a city and cars going, right? So, for example, if you want to go out, I don't know, near downtown at night, you can have your camera set on long exposure, and you can have to achieve the same effect because the cars will be moving along and the light will be moving along as well, right? So you will get a long exposure if you set it on a longer time, right? For example, 1 to 2 seconds, maybe 4 seconds, etc. So this is basically shorter time of the camera shutter opening, that equates to sharper image, while longer exposure, you're gonna get a light streak or something like that. Anyway, so shutter speed, fast, less exposure, right? We're talking about exposure here. Remember here, it makes sense, right? The larger your camera opens, the more light's gonna come in. Smaller is the camera opens, the less light will come in. The longer your camera, the sensor is exposed to light, the brighter. And then the less time the camera shutter is, the camera sensor is exposed to light, the less exposed, right? So think about back in my dot experiment about 12 p.m. So there is an abundance of light. Will you if you try long exposure at that time, will really work, right? You have to think about, if there's already tons of light and then you're exposing it for like 6 seconds, that may not seem a lot, but you're gonna come out with an image that is completely white, okay? So if you want to do long exposure, it is best to do it at night, or you have a neutral density filter on during the day, or a low light situation, right? So think about all these limitations and how you can overcome them, right? It all comes down to, what do you want your image to look like? What do you want your image to achieve, right? Do you really care about those soft background? Okay. If you don't care about the soft background, you can go again with a smaller exposure, smaller lens opening. So that is called prioritizing shutter speed. Okay. But if you really do care about whether or not your background is blurry or in focus, you will have to consider aperture before everything else, correct? Right? So there are a lot of creative intents that you have to consider when you're taking a picture. And by using this camera and these combinations, you will be able to achieve pretty amazing pictures and results. Okay, so let's go to ISO. ISO is basically sensitivity to light, especially digital sensitivity to light on our digital DSLRs, right? SLRs. You have to use it accordingly. So please make sure that to differentiate digital noise and film grain. Okay, so a lot of people use film grains for that nostalgic feeling, right? Those are aesthetic, creations. However, digital noise are much different. They are kind of just going on and off, right? It's not pleasing. Unlike film grain, digital noise is usually unwanted. Of course, you may have different opinion on them, and of course, if they help with you, then go ahead and use it. But I'm saying that most of the time, digital noise, you should avoid them, right? Because film grain is much different. And if you want to have the film grain effect, you can have, maybe a blender of a film grain, and then you can change the blend mode in Photoshop or Lightroom. But generally, avoid digital noise. How do you create digital noise? Well, that happens when you have a high ISO, right? Modern camera is pretty good in which that even if you go above, for example, like 1200 ISO, it's not gonna have that much grain in your image, right? So don't be afraid to raise your ISO if you absolutely need it, okay? If you're in a very, very dark light setting, so that accounts for indoor right now, right? I don't have any lights on, right? I might have to raise my ISO. Because if you don't, you're not going to capture anything. All your image is going to be dark, right? Then you can't even recover any information. So, have to wait in between those two. But generally, modern cameras have been so sophisticated that the digital noise issue shouldn't really be such a problem unless you're pushing it into its extremes, right? Usually, I wouldn't really care if it's like 800 ISO, 1200, 1600. Those are fine. But when my camera, this is from 2009, so it's pretty old now by today's standards. But when I push into the 16400, 3200, I start to get those unwanted digital noise. So know your camera's capabilities, right? If you're shooting on your phone, right, check your settings. If you're shooting on another camera, check its settings, right? Play around with the settings and know your limits is essentially what I'm saying here. Because for every single camera here, it's different. If you have a professional D7000 series, those are gonna have more tolerant with digital noise compared to a D3300 for a beginner level camera. So let's go back to the exposure camera triangle, and we can go over this one more time, right? If your aperture and shutter speed are both equally important, you will have to change your ISO, right? Usually, however, for me at least, when I shoot, I try to keep my ISO as low as possible. And then raise it accordingly, right? I start off with the lowest ISO setting, or if I know it's low light, I'll go ahead and put it in 1200, for example, 800, for example, and then kind of crank it down and see whether or not my image is affected, whether or not I'm getting enough information. To me, I feel like capturing images in camera is more about retaining information, because all the creative intent, this is for me personally, right? But for you guys, maybe you don't want to edit your picture, but that's completely fine. But for me, I like to have my creative intent to be done in Lightroom or Photoshop, post edits. So to me, capturing the most significant amount of information in my camera is my concern when I'm capturing image, right? So mainly there are 4 things that we talk about today, right? 2 things concerning aperture, 2 things concerning shutter speed. Those are pretty surface levels that you must understand before you move on. So one is that the larger the opening, the more light comes in, and therefore you can retain a blurry background, isolating your subject. Okay. Second thing for aperture is that if you want to retain a deep focus, so a smaller opening, therefore less light will come in, and you have a wider range of focus. So consider that. What are you trying to take a picture of, right? And then we have shutter speed. Shutter speed, essentially, if you want to freeze the moment, or do you want to have a longer exposure, right? This also is very important, right? If you're hand holding your camera and you have a slower shutter speed, your camera shakes, it's going to create some instability. Therefore, if you are hand holding a camera and you want your subject to be sharp, for example, taking a portrait, you gotta have a higher, a faster shutter speed, because camera shakes will ruin your picture, right? Your blurriness. And not finally ISO. You just have to consider more exposure, the higher number of ISO. Low exposure, less, like a lower number, right? So all three things here concern one single, issue here: the amount of exposure. So if you want to, we want to expose our image correctly, right? At least in this level. Later on, you may have, some people will care more about the highlights. They may want to shift intentionally, have a higher exposure. But for now, we want to retain as much information as possible. We want to have a balanced picture, right? So all these three tools are going to help us in creating, a perfect image, at least in this level. So yeah, and that is basically it. Today we basically talk about the triangle and the aperture, shutter speed, ISO. Does anyone have any questions in which they want to ask? If not, you're free to go. Thank you.